My parents forced me to give up my useless art degree for business school. 10 years later, they asked me to paint their portrait. I gave them a masterpiece of karma instead. My parents were always practical people. My dad was an accountant, my mom a real estate agent, and from as early as I can remember, they hammered into me the importance of having a stable career. A career that would pay well, provide security, and, as they loved to remind me, allow me to retire comfortably. Stability was the cornerstone of their advice, and for them, that meant only one thing: business. Art, on the other hand, was something they viewed as a hobby, a whimsical pursuit best left to people who could afford to live with their heads in the clouds. Unfortunately, I wasn't supposed to be one of those people. But art was my passion. From the moment I could hold a crayon, I knew I wanted to be an artist. I would sit for hours sketching, painting, or sculpting, creating a world of color and texture that was entirely my own. It was where I found peace and purpose. My art teachers saw potential in me, but my parents? Not so much. They smiled indulgently when I showed them my latest work, but there was always that tinge of disapproval behind their expressions, like I was doing something cute but ultimately pointless. In high school, my parents started to apply the pressure. They made it clear that if I wanted to go to college, I'd need to pick a real major. They argued that an art degree wouldn't lead to anything except disappointment and debt. But I was stubborn. Despite their warnings, I applied to art schools and got into a prestigious program that focused on fine arts and contemporary media. That acceptance letter was one of the happiest moments of my life, until I told my parents. They were furious. They accused me of throwing away my future for a pipe dream. I had never seen them so angry. The arguments dragged on for weeks, and I remember my father telling me, in no uncertain terms, that if I chose to pursue this ridiculous art degree, I'd be on my own financially. They wouldn't pay a single dime. It felt like they had drawn a line in the sand. But I wasn't ready to give up. I enrolled in the art program and decided I would figure things out on my own. I took out loans, got a part-time job, and tried to balance work, school, and my creative passions. It was tough, but I felt like I was on the right path. That was until the halfway point of my first year. One day, after another heated argument about my future, my father sat me down. I remember the exact words he said: "We love you, but you're making a mistake. And we can't stand by and watch you ruin your life. You need to switch to business school, or you're not welcome under this roof anymore." He framed it as if they were doing me a favor, saving me from myself. I was devastated. I didn't have the financial means to continue without their support, and the thought of completely cutting ties with them was too much to bear. In a moment of weakness, or maybe it was just sheer exhaustion from the constant fighting, I caved. I dropped out of art school and enrolled in business school, as they wanted. They were elated. I could see the relief on their faces, but I felt like a part of me had died that day. The next few years were a blur of boring classes, internships I couldn't care less about, and a growing resentment that festered beneath the surface. I got my degree in business management, and after graduation, I landed a cushy job in corporate finance. On paper, my parents were thrilled. I was making good money, climbing the ladder, and doing all the right things. But inside, I was miserable. I'd lost my passion for art, and every time I thought about picking up a brush, I felt a wave of sadness. It was like my creativity had been stifled, buried under layers of Excel sheets and client reports. I worked long hours, and though my paycheck was impressive, I had nothing to show for it except a nice apartment and a wardrobe full of suits I hated wearing. Meanwhile, my parents loved bragging about my success to their friends. They didn't mention the art thing anymore, as if it had never happened. It was as though they had successfully steered me away from a disaster into a life of prosperity. To them, I was living the dream. But I wasn't. Fast forward a decade, and I was still at the same company, now in middle management. My parents and I had a cordial relationship, though we weren't exactly close. I had buried my anger, and while I didn't agree with their decision, I figured there was no use dwelling on it. They were happy, and I was surviving. Then, about a year ago, something unexpected happened. My parents approached me with a request. They wanted me to paint their portrait. At first, I thought they were joking. It had been years since I had painted anything, and they had never shown any interest in my art before. But they were dead serious. They had seen a resurgence of family portrait paintings among their friends, Some kind of bourgeois trend, and now they wanted to hop on the bandwagon. I was dumbfounded. After all the grief they gave me about my art, now they wanted me to create something for them? The irony wasn't lost on me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this was an opportunity. They had taken my passion from me, or at least tried to, and now they wanted me to use that very thing to serve their vanity. I agreed to paint their portrait, but I had something else in mind. Over the next few months, I worked on the piece in secret. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not even my closest friends. I wanted it to be a surprise, but not the kind of surprise my parents were expecting. They thought they were getting a traditional, flattering family portrait. What they got was something far more honest. When the painting was finally finished, I invited them over to my apartment for the grand reveal. They were excited, talking about where they might hang it in the house, how their friends would be so impressed by my talent. All of it made me sick. I just smiled and played along, knowing what was coming. When I pulled the sheet off the painting, their expressions froze. The portrait I had painted wasn't the idyllic, glossy image they had envisioned. Instead, it was a raw, brutally honest depiction of our relationship. I had painted my father as a puppet master, strings extending from his fingers, controlling a marionette version of myself, dressed in a business suit with empty, hollow eyes. My mother was in the background, her face a mixture of pride and denial, holding a pair of scissors she never used to cut the strings. The entire scene was drenched in dark, muted tones, the only color coming from a canvas that the marionette me was staring at longingly, unable to reach. My parents were speechless. My father's face turned a shade of red I had never seen before, while my mother just stared, her eyes wide with shock. After what felt like an eternity, my father finally spoke. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with rage. I calmly explained the symbolism, how they had manipulated me into giving up my dream, how I had become a hollow version of myself because of their expectations, how they had effectively controlled my life for their own satisfaction. I told them that this painting was a reflection of the consequences of their actions, and that this was the portrait they truly deserved. My father stormed out. My mother tried to talk to me, to reason with me, but I was done. I told her that this was the last thing I would ever paint for them. They had taken my passion and twisted it into something ugly, and now they were finally seeing the result of that. We didn't speak for months after that. They were furious, and I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from their expectations, free from the burden of trying to please them. I started painting again, not for them, but for myself. And it was like a dam had burst. The creativity that had been stifled for so long came pouring out of me. I painted every day, losing myself in the colors and textures, rediscovering the joy that I had lost. Then came the update. A few weeks ago, I got a call from my mother. She was hesitant, almost apologetic, which was a shock in itself. She told me that they had been thinking a lot about the painting, about what I had said, and they realized that they had been wrong. She admitted that they had been too focused on what they thought was best for me, without considering what I actually wanted. It was the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get. She said they wanted to make things right, and that they would support me if I ever wanted to pursue art again. I didn't know how to respond. A part of me was still angry, but another part of me was just tired. Tired of holding on to that resentment. I told her I appreciated the sentiment, but I didn't need their approval anymore. I was going to live my life on my terms, whether they liked it or not. We're still working through things. My father hasn't said much, but I can tell he's trying, in his own way. And as for me? I quit my corporate job and opened a small studio. It's not glamorous, and I'm not making anywhere near as much money as I used to, but I'm happy. For the first time in a long time, I'm truly happy. And that's worth more than any paycheck. Final update. It's been about a year since my last post, and so much has changed that I felt it was time to give an update on where things stand. I never expected my story to resonate with so many people, and I'm incredibly grateful for all the kind messages and support from the Reddit community. Some of you even encouraged me to reach out to my parents and try to heal the rift that had formed. I took those words to heart, and while it hasn't been easy, we've made some real progress. After I quit my corporate job and opened my art studio, I honestly expected things to be a bit more glamorous. But life doesn't work that way, and the reality of pursuing my passion again came with its own set of challenges. Running a studio is hard work, especially when you've been out of the art world for so long. I had to rebuild everything from the ground up, and it wasn't an overnight success. There were weeks where I barely had enough commissions to cover rent, and I definitely had moments of doubt. But there was also something beautiful about the struggle. Every piece I created felt like a small victory, a step toward reclaiming the part of me that I had lost for so long. Slowly, word of mouth began to spread, and I started picking up more commissions. Some were from local businesses, some from private collectors, and a few from people who had seen my story online and wanted to support me. It wasn't easy, but it was fulfilling in a way that my old corporate job never was. Now for the part I know many of you are curious about, my relationship with my parents. After that initial phone call from my mom, things were tense for a while. She tried to reach out more often, but I was still wary. My father, on the other hand, remained mostly silent. He didn't say much to me directly, but my mom hinted that he was struggling with how to process everything. In his mind, he still believed that what they had done was out of love, but he was starting to realize that love can sometimes come with blind spots. He just didn't know how to apologize or admit that he might have been wrong. A few months ago, though, something unexpected happened. My mom and dad came to visit my studio. I wasn't sure what to expect when they walked through the door. It was awkward at first, to say the least. They had never shown much interest in my art before, but now they were standing in the middle of my workspace, surrounded by canvases and sculptures, trying to make sense of this part of my life they had once dismissed. My dad was quiet, just looking around, while my mom tried to make small talk about how nice the place looked. I could tell they were both nervous. Then, out of nowhere, my dad pointed to one of the paintings on the wall, one I had done shortly after quitting my job, and said, "I like this one." That might not sound like much, but coming from him, it was a lot. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first time he had ever acknowledged my art in a positive way. It was a small crack in the wall that had been built between us for so long. After that visit, things slowly started to change. My parents have made more of an effort to understand what I do, and they've even attended a couple of small gallery showings I've had. We're not completely healed, and there are still moments where I feel the weight of everything that happened, but it's better than it was. For the first time in years, I feel like we're all trying, really trying, to bridge the gap that's existed between us. The funny thing is, as my parents have started to come around, I've realized that I've also had to let go of some of my anger. For so long, I had held on to my resentment as a shield, something to protect myself from the hurt they had caused me. But in doing that, I was only keeping myself trapped. It took time, but I eventually realized that forgiveness, real, honest forgiveness, was more about freeing myself than it was about absolving them. It's not that I've forgotten what happened, and I'm not pretending that everything is perfect now. But I've learned that sometimes people need time to grow, to see their mistakes for what they are. And maybe it's not about waiting for a perfect apology, but recognizing the small ways people try to show they care, even if they don't know how to say it outright. As for my art, it's thriving. I'm not rolling in money, but I've got a steady stream of clients and a few exciting projects lined up for the future. I've even started to branch out into teaching, holding small workshops for aspiring artists who, like me, once felt their passion was dismissed by those closest to them. Helping others rediscover their creativity has been one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. It feels like I'm finally living the life I was meant to live, on my terms. And for anyone wondering, no, I haven't painted another portrait of my parents. That chapter is closed, and honestly, I think they understand why. But sometimes, when they visit, they'll point to a new piece I'm working on and ask questions about it. It's not much, but it's a start. So, that's where things stand now. Life is far from perfect, but I've found a sense of peace that I didn't think was possible a few years ago. My relationship with my parents is still a work in progress, and maybe it always will be, but we're moving forward, slowly but surely. I've let go of the need to prove anything to them anymore. I'm doing this for me now. And that, in itself, is the biggest victory I could have asked for. Thanks again to everyone who followed my story, supported me, and shared their own experiences. It helped more than you'll ever know.